And now, marine weather around Alaska.
We'll start off the marine segment here with tonight's weather. We've got a low pressure area tracking across south central Alaska with mixed precipitation across much of the area, Copper River Basin, where some rather moderate amounts of snow could fall in the mountainous areas. Up around Paxton could see 4 to 8 inches. Other areas seeing less. Some areas seeing some freezing rain, sleet, and North Gulf Coast here, rain or rain and snow mixed, and that pattern pushing into the southeast coast. Cold front up here with some areas of light snow associated with it, and the next storm here in the Aleutians, bringing rain and some wind into that area. Tomorrow that shifts northeastward here, front bringing gusty winds and precipitation to the Alaska Peninsula. Some areas of light snow along the southwest coast. Strong north winds gusting to 50-55 miles an hour. Gale force winds for the central Aleutians with colder air coming down for snow there. Still some snow along this cold front up here to the north, but drier conditions here across southern Alaska. And that front weakens continues to weaken along the southeast coast for continued damp conditions there, and light snow tapering off, or snow becoming lighter and eventually tapering off there in the Copper River Basin. And then for Tuesday, that leads to a partly cloudy day for the Copper River Basin here up into the eastern interior, southwestward along the Kuskokwim Valley. And Arctic front up here, bringing an increasing area of snow from the central Brooks Range down across the Kobuk Valley in toward Kotzebue, Seward Peninsula here, and the Yukon Delta, with this low tracking just along the north shore of the Alaska Peninsula. And the associated front bringing another round of increasing wind and precipitation to the North Gulf Coast, especially the southern Kenai Peninsula here. Rain and wind for Kodiak Island. And out to the west, a couple of fronts out in that area, bringing some rain and snow. A little bit of an increase in the winds to those locations. Coastal water forecasts here for the south coast of the Panhandle. Southwesterlies 15 knots tomorrow, west-southwest at 20 for the central coast, and small craft advisories on the north coast for 25-knot winds out of the west-southwest. Small craft advisories for the inside water areas and channels, south to southeast winds, 25 knots. And for Tuesday, we've got increase in the winds here, east 30 to 40 knots for the northern coast, central and south coast, east-southeast 25 to 30 knots, and Clarence Strait looking at small craft advisories for southeasterlies at 25, just 10 knots out of the southeast for Stevens Passage, and 15 knots for the Lynn Canal area. Prince William Sound tomorrow, light southwest breeze at 10 knots with 2-foot seas. North Gulf Coast, west to southwest, 20 to 25 knots. Cook Inlet, south to southwest winds, 10 to 15 knots. Barren Islands, Kamishak Bay, southwesterlies at 20 knots. And for the day on Tuesday, with that next front pressing northward here, we've got pretty uniform winds, gales here, Kamishak Bay, Barren Islands, North Gulf Coast, all out of the east and southeast at 40 knots. Southern Cook Inlet, northeast at 30 knots. Prince William Sound, east winds 30 knots, 7-foot seas there, and 25-knot northeast winds for Northern Cook Inlet. Kodiak Island tomorrow, south winds 20 to 25, east to southeast winds 25 to 30 knots for the Alaska Peninsula, and southeast 25 there in Bristol Bay. Gale warnings here for Bristol Bay on Tuesday, southeast 35 knots, otherwise the Alaska Peninsula, west to southwesterlies at 25 to 30 knots. Gale warnings for Kodiak Island, east-southeast 35 knots. Eastern Aleutians, east to variable winds at 10 to 25 knots. Northerly gales there for Adak and Atka, again with gusts to 50-55 miles an hour. Out of the north, those sustained at 40 knots, and that pattern extends over to about Amchitka Island. Western Aleutians, westerlies at 20 to 25 knots. And then for the day on Tuesday, Western Aleutians, gale warnings, southwest 35 to 40 knots, west 35 knots for Adak and Atka, and northwest 40 knots for the Eastern Aleutians. And looking at the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta coastline, actually for the Kuskokwim Delta coast, south of Nunivak Island, east winds 30 knots tomorrow, north 15, Yukon Delta coast, St. Lawrence Island, west 15, Norton Sound. Gale warnings for the Pribilof Islands, north 35 knots, seas 10 feet, northeast at 25 for St. Matthew Island. And for the Pribilofs on Tuesday, northwest winds 40 knots, northeast at 30 knots for St. Matthew Island. And for Norton Sound, northeast 25, north 25 St. Lawrence Island, north 30 knots now for the Yukon Delta coast, and gale warnings for the Kuskokwim Delta coast at 35 knots. And for the Chukchi Sea, tomorrow, south to southwest winds 15 to 20 knots, and brisk wind advisories for the Arctic coast, southwest 25 to 30 knots. And then for Tuesday, eastern Boulevard Sea coast, kind of a more lighter variable wind here, east to south or west to southeast 15 to 20 knots, southwest 20 knots there for the central coast. Brisk wind advisories to the western coastline there for south to southwest wind at 25 knots. Otherwise, the Chukchi Sea much lighter, north to northeast at 10 knots.